All right. Well, thank you, everybody. We still have people filtering in for those of you online. Welcome to the annual release of the Disability Statistics Compendium and annual report. We're happy to have the people in the room. And also, I think last time I heard was about 350 people had registered online, and I expect that they're all up and early, especially the California folks are probably already online having their coffee and watching us here today. But they can always catch up if they wake up late and look at this online. All the materials will be archived on disabilitycompendium.org. You can see last year's presentations and see whether I'm wearing the same tie and jacket. Probably the same jacket.
I'm pretty sure I'm wearing the same tie.
Yeah, Michael, I'm sure. I think you are. You wore a blue shirt last year. I remember that. So welcome. I'd like to say a few words before turning it over to Michael. The release of statistics is really a great opportunity. This event is actually modeled after the release of the poverty statistics, which is typically in September of each year, coinciding with the release of the Current Population Survey's annual social and economic supplement, which is the main source for poverty rates in the United States. And you can see a flurry of activity around poverty in September, in part because of that release. And so many years ago, Richard Burkhauser, a colleague of mine at Cornell, had the idea, let's do the same for disability. Let's bring people together and create a document which we can unveil every year, go down to DC and do it, that's where we are today. So for a release of statistics, what I really get from it, and what I'm hoping all of you get from it, is a few things. One is it gives us an opportunity to talk about current events, right? The current state of affairs, right? With the most recent data available. And that's what the compendium and the annual report represent. They also give us an opportunity to reflect on the past, right? So you get to see statistics from the past. In the compendium website, you can see archives of the compendium. But the annual report also looks at long-term trends for as long as we have them. At least with the most recent ways that disability is conceived of in the federal surveys. All right. And so it really gives us an opportunity to reflect on the past. But I think more importantly, and the reason why I always struggle with online participation, because I love seeing people here, is it gives an opportunity for the end users of statistics and the producers of statistics to get together. The way we see it, Dave Wittenberg and I were talking from Mathematica, were talking about it last night. It's really the opportunity to bring those two groups together, because to have effective statistics, to have effective portrayals of the lives and experiences of people with disabilities, the end users of statistics and the producers of statistics really need to work effectively together, to interact together, right? I think everybody has always these great intentions, right? Producers want to produce the most accurate and useful statistics in a timely way. The end users want to use it effectively and tell stories and test hypotheses and do all kinds of things with the data. But it's rare that those two groups get a chance to meet, and that's what we're hoping to do today. We've expanded it to a full-day event. We always had done it as a half-day event in years other than the ones that our State of the Science Conference is held. And now we're going to make a full-day event, right? And so this year we're adding a panel after lunch, and then all people online are going to have to get your own lunches. I think we could FedEx them to people, but I don't think that's part of the typical expectation for a conference. That was funny. Thank you for laughing. That's why Michael's here. You laughed. So, they probably can't hear it, so this is you laughing, so this is probably like a Howard Dean moment.
Yeah, we got a laugh track going.
Laugh track. So what I was saying is we've expanded the event. And as we've always done, we're going to hear about the latest results from Louis and Eric, and I will talk about them as well. And then we're going to have a panel of federal organizations to talk about their efforts to collect and distribute disability statistics. And then after lunch, we're going to have a little bit of a scientific panel. In future years, we're hoping to add a consumer panel and then have a mixture of those two panels, with both the users and the producers of statistics. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to turn it over to Michael. However, I'm going to do the housekeeping things that I forgot. Please turn off your cell phones. For those of you in the audience, there is a Wi-Fi connection. Click on the Wi-Fi icon, choose Visitor, and then click on Connect. Go to www.nas.edu, so National Academy of Science.edu, and then access Internet. Right? So you can use that hotspot that's available. If the bathrooms are down the hallway, over behind the stuff, there should be signs. And most of all, everybody have a great time. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Andrew. So I am excited to be here, as I am always excited. But I love this annual gathering where we come together and look at these statistics. My name is Michael Murray. I am the director of the Disability Employment Policy team at the Office of Disability Employment Policy at the Department of Labor. In the federal government, we love strange long titles, don't we? But man, I'm excited to be here, and I know I can see from the audience so many dear friends out there, and I'm sure many of you online are as excited as I am. You know, we see that employers typically hire folks with disabilities for three reasons. The first reason is because they have to. There's some kind of law, some kind of requirement, some kind of executive order, some kind of, their boss comes to them and says you have to hire folks with disabilities, and so they do it. And again, that's not necessarily a bad reason. In fact, that's the foundation that we work from in order to build a society that includes folks with disabilities. The second reason that I've seen employers hire folks with disabilities is because it's the right thing to do. We're an equal opportunity community. Anybody can join us at any time. It doesn't matter your race, your ethnicity, your socioeconomic status, who your daddy was, who your mommy was. You can become a person with a disability at any time. And the longer you live, the more likely you are to acquire a disability. The more hair I lose, the more my knees hurt. And I see Andrew and Eric laughing with me because we know that we got a little bit less hair than we used to.
Eric has a lot more hair than we do.
Hair. I'm sorry, Lewis. Sorry, Lewis, I didn't mean to leave you out of the Baldadarity Club. But the reality is that sometimes can cause, when we do it because it's the right thing to do and we hire folks and we bring folks with disabilities into the workforce, it can sometimes cause a little bit of pity there, right? Because we're doing it because it's some kind of moral objective. And then that brings us to the third reason that we see folks hire people with disabilities, and it's because it leads, when you include that diversity inside of the disability community, it leads to innovation, creativity, new ideas, new perspectives that ultimately lead to better companies, better products, and us being able to better serve the American people. For any of that to happen, regardless of what reason we see employers hire folks with disabilities, we've got to have the numbers. What gets counted gets done, and at the Office of Disability Employment Policy, I think that we are driving inclusion, but we can't do it without the numbers that Andrew produces every year. I am an end user. I will tell you guys that sometimes I look over this stuff and I get so excited about it, but I still have no idea what I'm looking at. But man, I know how valuable it is, because without it, we can't push the envelope. We can't decide what's working, what laws or executive orders are making a difference, what kind of programs are pushing the envelope and ensuring that we're going to create a workforce that includes folks with disabilities. All of this is dependent and foundational to that are these statistics. So that's what gets me excited. You guys pumped? Whoa, is everybody in the audience pumped? Let me hear you say, yeah! Oh, all right. There we go. We got some excited folks. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to some folks that are smarter than I am, but also that have really dived into this, understand these statistics, and can really help us continue to push this forward, whether you're an end user or you're bridging that gap as someone who is creating these statistics. Today is going to be a lot of fun, and it's going to help us move the work forward. So, Andrew, I'm not sure, are we starting with Louis or Eric?
I believe Eric is first.
Eric is first. All right. So without further ado, Eric is a project director at the University of New Hampshire. He's spent the last 14 years developing his interest in disability mental health. Wow. Also, Eric is going to be a new father very soon. Come on, that's exciting. Let's give Eric a big round of applause. Let's get excited for him. Bring it on up, man. I didn't know that. That is so exciting. So exciting.
Thank you very much for that support. Excited to become a dad. So good morning. My name is Eric Lauer. I'm a researcher at the University of New Hampshire working on the Disability Statistics and Demographics, ROTC. I'm here to present a little bit of background and what's new with the 2017 compendium this year. Today I will discuss the purpose of the compendium, our efforts to improve accessibility, our development of a state-specific report with county-level data, and where people can go to access the compendium and technical assistance. The compendium is an amalgam of statistics for people with disabilities. It uses multiple data sources to provide an overall picture of the experiences of people with disabilities living in the United States. The impetus behind the compendium stems from the fact that disability statistics are spread across multiple agencies, websites, reports, and data sources. They're often difficult to find and interpret and compare. The goal of the compendium is to gather all of this data together in one transparent, accessible source. The compendium uses multiple data sources from over 8 federal agencies. Some examples and uses include the data sources include the American Community Survey, which is used for its data collected that is similar to the decennial census. The Current Population Survey is utilized for its labor force statistics. Health statistics are gathered from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance Survey. And Social Security Administration reports are used to present a profile of people receiving Social Security disability benefits. And there are many other examples. The topics in the compendium include prevalence, demographic characteristics, health, employment, Social Security disability benefits, and health insurance. Where possible, statistics for people with disabilities are broken down by demographic factors for each topic. The compendium focuses on counts and percentages and a few other statistics. All information provided is detailed with section text, interpretations, and a complete glossary of terms and definitions. In addition, last year we added over 150 tables and created a Compendium Supplement, which is an online resource with hundreds of tables of additional breakdowns of disability statistics that complements the primary compendium. This year we focused on 2 major areas. The first was accessibility. We created the functionality to have the compendium and compendium supplement to both have HTML versions available on the website to read and download. The second area we developed was for state-specific reports. These reports focus on county-level statistics. They have tables similar to the compendium, but for all the counties in a given state. In addition, they include county-level maps for both percentages and counts. They also include dynamic interpretive text. This text highlights various statistics about the county-level data, including the mean, median, and range of disability estimates across counties. This text changes depending on the state you choose for the report and will vary depending on the topic of the report being viewed. And finally, the same architecture we designed for the compendium and compendium supplement HTML was implemented for the state-specific reports. HTML versions of this report can be viewed online or downloaded in the same fashion as the compendium. This slide presents examples of maps that we are generating for the state-specific county-level reports. They both show the percentage of people with disabilities in Alabama and Texas, respectively. The darker the red color, the higher the percentage of people with disabilities in a county. In a given state report, there are maps like these for both counts and percentages of people with disabilities depending on the topic. Our future plans include expanding the topics for state-specific reports and many other topics, but they'll be named in our upcoming grant proposal.
I like all that redacted text you got going on there.
It's really awesome stuff underneath that.
Thank you very much.
Awesome, awesome. So you can see they've added some new stuff. We've got some new exciting stuff going on. Let's dive a little bit more in. Lewis, bring it on up. This man needs no introduction, so I'm not going to try to do it. You'll see. You'll see. Lewis, do it. Give him a round of applause.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Louis Kraus from the Center on Disability, the Public Health Institute, and I'm going to talk to you today about the Disability Statistics Annual Report. So this is a presentation of the data in a way that's visual and breaks it down in a very quick and easy manner. And I wanted to review some of the state-level data from the annual report with you today. And as some of you may be aware, with the annual report, you know that this graphical display of the data by state lends itself to a more nuanced understanding of the data. So let's start off with the percentage of people with disabilities in the United States. In 2016, the state with the lowest percentage of population having disabilities was Utah at 9.9%. The state with the highest percentage was West Virginia, more than twice as high with a percentage of 20.1%. And for the most part, these higher percentages you can see of people with disabilities were clustered in the southern U.S. around the lower Mississippi River region, and the concentration is also high in the states of Maine, New Mexico, Oklahoma, and Oregon. Obviously, again, before I go on, the darker colors are the higher percentages, the lighter colors, the lower percentages. Looking at the percentage of people with disabilities by age group, you can see that among children under 5 years old, the percentage of those with disabilities was very low, about 0.7% nationally, and 2.8% or less in every state. The states with the highest percentages were Nevada and Rhode Island. 40 states had percentages equal or less to 1%. For children ages 5 to 17, the percentages of those with disabilities range from 3.6% in Hawaii to more than twice that in Maine at 8.3%. In general, the percentages for this age group were lower in the states around the Rockies, the upper Great Plains, the Pacific Coast, and Hawaii, and more concentrated in the eastern and southern U.S. As we move on to the adults in the age 18 to 64 range, the highest percentages of people with disabilities were in the states in the southern U.S. from Oklahoma to West Virginia, also Maine and Vermont. The percentage was lowest in New Jersey and Hawaii at 7.9% and more than twice as high in West Virginia at 17.8%. And as I'm sure you're aware, the highest percentages of people with disabilities were in the U.S. At ages 65 and over, and more than 1/3 of the civilian population for this age group of 35.2% had disabilities. In 9 states, primarily in the South, the percentage of people with the percentage of people ages 65 and over with disabilities was 40% or over, or more than 2 of every 5 elderly people. That would be West Virginia, Kentucky, Oklahoma, Mississippi, Alabama, Arkansas, New Mexico, Louisiana, and Alaska. The percentages of people with disabilities were generally lowest in the Northeast, the Central Atlantic states, and some upper Midwest states. 14 states had disability percentages of less than 1/3 of the elderly. Now I thought it would be a good idea to look at all 4 of those together, and you can see a pattern emerging. As the population ages, it moves from a disparate, almost random smattering of high and low disability states for those under 5 in that upper left map, to a slow but steady move to the southern states and Maine and Vermont in the working ages, ending with a solid block of high disability percentage states in the central southern U.S., along with Wyoming and Alaska for those ages 65 and over. Now turning to a familiar topic, employment. This slide depicts how rates of employment varied by state. For people with disabilities, employment rates range from a high of 54% in North Dakota to a low of 27.4% in West Virginia. But you can see a solid block of high disability employment states in the upper Midwest and a generally low disability employment segment in the Southeast. Now, if you look at the slide for those without disabilities, the employment ranged from 70.8% in West Virginia to 84.2% in North Dakota. So I just showed you those together. Now let's see them side by side, and this is an important comparison. You can see the general rates of employment actually follow similar patterns, sometimes follow similar patterns for those with and without disabilities, especially in the upper Midwest, where we see high rates of employment, and the Southeast, where we see low rates of employment. So we chose to present this as a gap to show where there might be something particularly happening for people with disabilities. Here it is. This slide shows that gap in percentage between those with and without disabilities by state. Now those upper Midwest states' high employment rates for both people with and without disabilities change this map. What we're left with is that states with the largest gap were concentrated generally from the Missouri eastward and California. While the state's employment gaps narrowed from the previous year, in 34 states the employment percentage gap was 30 percentage points or greater. The highest gaps were in Rhode Island at 39.5 points, Maine 36.4 points, District of Columbia 35.7 points. In only 3 states where there was the gap less than 23 percentage points. That was Alaska at 19.8 points and North and South Dakota each at 22.4 points. Looking now at median earnings by state, the slide shows the range of median earnings in states for people with disabilities. In 2016 was $17,480 in West Virginia to $30,559 in Alaska. In 11 states, the median earnings for people with disabilities was over $25,000, while 6 states had median earnings for people with disabilities of lower than $20,000. In comparison to that last slide, the median earnings for people without disabilities, age 16 and over, range from $27,431 in Idaho to $51,302 in the District of Columbia. Now looking at the map, the gap map again, we can see that while states varied widely in earnings gap from a low of $5,242 in Idaho to a high of $23,144 right here in District of Columbia. Generally, states in the northeastern U.S. had higher earnings gaps. States in the southern U.S. had lower earnings gaps. Moving on to poverty, let's go straight to the gap map here. The poverty gap between those with and without disabilities by state in 2016. The highest poverty gaps were seen mostly in the northeast U.S., bordering the states of the Great Lakes, and as well as Kentucky, Missouri, and South Dakota. Gaps ranged from a high of 14 percentage points in the District of Columbia to a low of 1.5 percentage points in New Mexico. Looking at the gap by age, for children under age 5, the poverty gap was highest in New Hampshire, 60.3 percentage points. Sorry. Arkansas, 47.2, and Mississippi, 42.6 points. For children ages 5 and under, 15 states had a negative poverty gap, meaning a higher percentage of those without disabilities were in poverty than those with disabilities. The poverty gap for those ages 5 to 17 with and without disabilities ranged from a low of 1.3 percentage points in Hawaii to 19 points in Maine.
Boo.
There are 9 states with a gap of at least 15 points and 26 with a gap of at least 10 points, meaning that in those states, the poverty rates were 10 to 15 or more percentage points higher for those with disabilities than those without disabilities. For people ages 18 to 64, the poverty gap between those with and without disabilities ranged from a low of 7.4 percentage points in Delaware to a high of 24.8 points in District of Columbia. Nearly half the states, 24 states, had gaps of 15 points or more. All but 3 states had gaps over 10 points. Poverty gaps for those ages 65 and over with and without disabilities had a low of 1.7 points in Nevada to 8.6 points in South Dakota. 3 states had gaps below 3 points, and that was Nevada, Vermont, and Delaware. Obviously, these have policy implications that you can see pretty clearly. Now let's move on to health. The gap between smokers with and without disabilities by state in 2016 ranged from a low of 5.2 percentage points in South Dakota to a high of 16.6 points in Missouri. 36 states had a gap of 10 percentage points or higher. South Dakota was the only state to have a gap of 6 percentage points or lower. And this data is from the Behavioral Risk Factor Surveillance System. And actually, in 2016, it changed the questions used to measure disability to match those used in the American Community Survey.
You're one slide behind.
Oh, sorry about that. Did everybody get a chance to see that smoking percentage map? Okay, sorry about that. Okay, there you go. Okay, the next slide is on obesity and shows the gap in obesity percentages for states range from a high of 16.8 percentage points in Rhode Island to a low of 7.3 in Mississippi. 9 states had a gap under 10 percentage points, while 7 states had a gap of 15 points or more. And this last slide here shows gaps in binge drinking for people with and without disabilities in 2016. The gaps in binge drinking for those 18 and over ranged from 11.7 points less, thus more people without disabilities binge drinking than those with disabilities in the District of Columbia, to 1.6 points less in Utah. 21 states had a gap of less than 5 points. And that's the end of that. That's my contact information. Thank you.
Thank you, Lewis.
And so, like Lewis, Andrew needs no introduction as he's already been introduced. I do want to tell you guys, though, we are going to open it up for questions shortly after Andrew gets done, so make sure you're writing those down. We are going to bring those questions to the floor. Andrew.
All right, so Lewis talked about variation across state in many of the topics that are covered in the compendium and the topics that are summarized in the annual report. There's some really interesting findings. A lot of times we produce so much data we don't have time to look at the state variation, and we're happy to see some of you use those kinds of data as you do your work. Today I'm going to look at a specific trend. So the annual report also contains time trend information, mostly dating back to 2008. When you do time trends, you have to kind of keep a careful eye on changes in the way that surveys are either designed or questions are asked, because you don't want to report something that's just perhaps due to a change in the way the survey or the data was collected. This comes from the annual report and various compendiums. We do have those archived. So what you can see is, and we'll show it a little bit more in detail, this is the percentage employed and the percentage employed for people with and without disability. So the percentage employed is not the 100 minus the unemployment rate. It's actually the percentage of people who are working divided by the total population, right? So the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses the term employment to population ratio for that statistic. The unemployment rate's a little more nuanced. If you're not looking for work, you're actually not counted in the denominator. Here, people who are not actively looking for work for various reasons are included in the denominator. So what we see here is if we, let's focus on the the percentage of people with disabilities that are employed. So it starts out with 39.1%, right? And then we see the Great Recession. Basically, this is the beginning. This is just after the height of the Great Recession. You see job loss continuing down to 35.3 to 33.4% to 32.6% in 2011. And then you see it level off for quite a while. The next 2 years at 32.7 to 33.9, and then you start seeing a rise. So it's 34.4 in 2014, 34.9 in 2015, and then the most recent data available for from the American Community Survey, which is the underlying source, is 35.9%. Right? But you see, for people without disabilities, you see a similar pattern. You see a decline, but the rise, the slow, steady rise, begins basically in 2010, 2011, and then it starts to rise thereafter. With regard to the gap, as Lewis described it, the percentage point gap between those two numbers, we saw we've basically been seeing a rise until very recently, until this year in the American Community Survey, when it went from 41.1 percentage points to 40.9 percentage points. And so that's good news. And we actually have more recent data that I'll present in a second. And that, if you're not aware of, the Kessler Foundation and UNH and AUCD do a monthly webcast and a monthly report on employment of people with disabilities. So,
And it's awesome.
It's called NTIDE, N-T-I-D-E.
NTIDE.
National Trends in Employment and Disability. And you can either go to UNH or Kessler's website to find the release of those data. So let me talk a bit about the longer term, right? So typically what you'll see are recessions. So we have the 1981, 1982-3 recession, the 1990, George Bush, the senior during his years. Then you see the downsizing recession in 2001, and then you see the Great Recession really starting early in 2008. February 2008 and August 2008 were the big down times for the Great Recession in terms of job loss. So here we see that percentage point gap, right? So you see the slight rise, you see the dip, and then it's a little hard. I'll show it a little bit later. You see a small dip in the gap to go to 40.9 percentage points. Right, so that's the graph that you just saw. That's the numbers in between that you saw. Next, we'll add in the most recent data from the current population survey. So this is a little clearer. So you have an extra year of data. These are basically average monthly employment rates, employment to population ratios. And these are derived from the NTIDE numbers. Right, slight difference in the ages used for these. But these are using the same disability questions, the 6-question sequence that was first developed for the American Community Survey. So it's using roughly the same definition of disability. And so you see these things start right before the Great Recession. And we're seeing the gap rising but declining in recent years. So now we're going to look at another data series. This is coming from the Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement. This is ages 16 to 64. And so this is showing what's a single definition of disability. Do you have a condition that limits the kind of amount of work you can do? And this is the gap between the employment to population ratio for people with and without work-limiting disabilities. And so what you can see is there's been a steady rise over the last 3-4 decades in the employment gap for that population, for using that kind of definition of disability. There was a big change in 2014. I'll start presenting numbers next year, catching back up, but there will be a big seam between those because there's kind of an unexplained, well, they changed some of the design of the survey and the way they clean the data, so I didn't want to present that just yet. So we see this basically a long increase. And what this means is look at how many times it actually went down. Basically, just after recessions, it starts to go down. It's very rare that we actually see the employment to population ratio gap go down. And let's zoom in, right? And so here you can see, particularly the middle row, the middle line, you'll see the decline that the Untitled has been reporting over the last couple years. We've really had an unprecedented run of good months in the employment of people with disabilities. And this is really telling, you'll probably hear it on the radio or on the web, the radio. Wow, that's dating me, I guess.
I still listen to the radio.
Yeah. It's dating you too. So basically what you're seeing is something called full employment, right? And so the economy is reaching levels of employment such that traditionally untapped groups are being tapped for the job market, and that includes people with disabilities. It's nice to see it increasing. However, it would have been nice to see it increase just alongside everybody else and not have to wait till full employment to reach that level. All right. This is the monthly chart that the Untitled reports in the employment to population ratio. And so here you see a decline. Actually, this is ages 16 to 64. That's a typo. What you see is basically at the beginning, we had an employment to population ratio of 32.7% for people with disabilities. It's still not at that level. We're at about the last month we had December, it would be January. We had 29.9% for people with disabilities. And so there's a long way to go. And if we look at kind of the trend lines, we see that there's a slow, steady recovery for people without disabilities, but for people with disabilities, the recovery really didn't start happening until the last 2 years. If we took out the last 2 years, we'd basically be in a kind of a flat state after the Great Recession. So it really isn't until recently. And that may be that full employment picture coming in. Now, one thing, that it's great to see this news, but there's still a long way to go. This gap is tremendous. These are charts. This chart is actually graphing them on two different scales, two different axes, and this gap is actually bigger if I produce them on the same axes. They're the same scale, but different height axes. So I'll turn that over to Michael, and we'll do Q&A. Feel free. I think we have a way for people to submit questions online. I think, Anna, are you the one that's going to be conveying those? Or Anna's in the back. She's saying yes. So feel free to type in some questions online, and we'll see what we can do.
Awesome. Let's give Andrew a round of applause, and let's give all three of our dear friends up here a good round of applause. I am excited to hear some of your questions. I will start calling on you. And I'm looking at some of my friends in the audience, I'm seeing Savi and Richard over there. I'm seeing a few of my friends out there that I may rob in. So get your questions ready, because I will.
So there are mics in the middle.
And there are mics in the middle. So go ahead and. Are we having somebody bring them around? Yeah, we're having somebody bring them around. And let's start by just stating your name and who you work for.
Now we're on.
Yep.
Now we're on. Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I'm Rick Hernandez with the U.S. Department of Education, Office of Career, Technical, and Adult Education. I guess one of my questions is, are we looking at the ACS data, can we disentangle those people whose disability may be related to their military service? And is that of interest to us?
So yeah, that is possible. It's not produced by the Census Bureau, but certainly with the public use files, we could look at people with service-connected disabilities. We have that ability, and we can tell which conflict they were serving under, not necessarily the conflicts they may have served under. So we can, and age and race and gender, and so with the public use files, we'll have that ability. It gets difficult to do it by state, as the sample gets a little smaller for certain states. But that capacity certainly is there. And I should add two things. One is, if people have interests in specific questions or want to see things cut a little bit differently, there are two things you can do. One is look at the supplement. So the compendium has this big supplement, and we've actually produced a few. That gives breakdowns by age, race, and gender. And so you might be able to find some statistics there that break it down in a way that you'd like. The other thing is to call us, right? I wouldn't call that number right there, but at the bottom of the, because that one, I barely answer email, let alone telephone
I have his
calls.
personal cell.
Yeah, you do.
I'll pass it out.
But at the bottom of the compendium, there's a toll-free number, and there's a disability statistics at unh.edu that you can access. And we are able to do some special estimates for folks, and that's with the great support of our funder, NIDLR, so the National Institute on Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. And I see a few project officers from NIDLR here, and all of this would not be possible without funding through NIDLR. So.
Awesome. So I'm going to go to the young man in the purple shirt, and then I'm going to come to Philip up front.
Good morning. My name is Mark Myers. I work at Gallaudet University. I've been quite fascinated by the statistical information that's been presented so far. My question is regarding job requirements and the requirements for study not only in school but then outside of school. Comparing that to my experience as a college student in the 1980s, for example, I'm wondering if we have, if we're looking at statistics over time, over the course of several decades, where those requirements may have changed, what information would be important then, and can we separate those requirements out from the statistics that would boil out of those numbers?
Yeah, that's a great question, because job requirements have certainly changed. The nature of the economy has changed in terms of types of jobs that are present in the economy. It's been many years now, but a colleague of mine, Dave Stapleton and Nanette Goodman, did a study that kind of held constant the nature of work, and the decline in employment still occurred. So that research is quite old, but there are some new elements, and perhaps there's someone from BLS today, they may be able to touch on some of this. Social Security Administration has been working with the Bureau of Labor Statistics to do what's now called the Occupational Requirements Survey. And data for the 2006 data take is now available. And so it looks at what are the requirements of data. And eventually SSA will be using these data to determine whether there are jobs in the economy that certain individuals or certain people with certain types of impairments can do. And so the idea that job requirements are changing over time, that's not really collected, but there are efforts to use occupational information and then also use things like the American Community Survey to graft in, to crosswalk in requirements of jobs using workers in those files, in those surveys as a way to characterize requirements in the economy. That said, when I do look at employment trends by disability type, the 6 basic types of disability that are identified in the American Community Survey, it really ends up being, I think, and it's not, I haven't been able to find statistically significant results. That the samples become kind of small. But my hunch, and it's kind of an ongoing hypothesis that I'm looking to try to test with the data, is that people with physical and sensory disabilities have done quite well in the economy as the economy and the requirements have changed, or people with cognitive impairments less so, as those types of accommodations are less forthcoming, although increasing with the use of text-to-speech, speech-to-text kind of technology.
Excellent, excellent. Philip.
Thank Thank you very much. Philip Conpolly from Respectability, and thank you so much for all your work, and thank you for this great information. And you give advocates some very powerful tools, but I kind of want to touch on the occupational question that you raised. And maybe it's my natural pessimism flaring up, but I mean, people with disabilities have always had the experience of being the last hired and the first fired, and the fact that we're regaining ground we lost in the Great Recession. And any good economist will tell you that another recession is guaranteed. And so I worry how vulnerable the job gains that people with disabilities have made are to just the trends and forces of the cold science of economics. Now, for the question, I'm curious, now that we have all of this updated information and a lot more sophisticated information out there, is there an opportunity to correlate what we have and what you have with job occupational categories to really look at, are people with disabilities going into retail, are they going into advanced manufacturing, to see what sectors of the economy people with disabilities are gaining the most ground in? Thank you.
You guys can chime in if you know differently. I believe the occupational information is disability employment by occupation is available on American Fact Finder. If you can't find it there, I know ODEP supported some special estimates. I'm not sure if those are annually updated or not, but they're available, they're feasible, and Doug Cruz at Rutgers University did a really phenomenal study, in part funded by Neidler, that looked at occupational composition of people with disabilities. So that's a research study, but raw actual data, updated data, I believe FactFinder has it, but if not, you could give us a call.
Anybody else want to chime in on that? Good.
ODEP could always repay census to run those data files again. Oh, that's you.
I will not speak on behalf of ODEP, but I can definitely say that ODEP is awesome and here to serve without committing us to anything. So I see some of my dear friends out there that I know have some incredible questions. Oh, we got one right there. Go for it.
Morning.
Morning.
It's on? Yeah.
Morning.
This is Joanne Schneider, Chrysalis Collaborations in George Washington University. Andrew, I want to ask you about disaggregating a couple of statistics, and also to ask about something that I was seeing in a project that I'm just finishing up. First of all, as we know, in 2008 through whatever, the Great Recession, there was a huge laying off of people who were older and disabled, right? And we're not talking about the people who become disabled at 65, but the ones who've been disabled for a very long time and have been working for a very long time. And I'm wondering if you have looked more closely at that population and whether they are finding work again. That's question one. Question two, and this is about the IDD population, those with intellectual disabilities, not mental health, intellectual disabilities. And I am just finishing up, or rather we finished, and I'm working on the white papers now, on a project that was looking at the impact in changes in policy on employment for people with IDD as we move away from sheltered workshops and into integrated employment. And one of the unintended side effects is that once those sheltered workshops, as bad as they can often be, go away, often there are not the jobs, or it takes a long time to find the jobs in the community for folks, particularly if you're doing customized employment, et cetera. And I'm wondering what you're seeing in your statistics on that.
Well, there are two questions there. I'll answer the last one first. In the federal surveys, there's not an ability to distinguish between sheltered workshop employment, customized employment, or non-customized market jobs. So it's difficult to say. There's not data in there. I've done some work looking at Oregon and Washington. It's difficult because also in the federal surveys, there's no way to identify people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There's a cognitive question, and that could be answered by people with many different underlying conditions. So there's really no way to drill down, and that's one of the biggest gaps in data collection. That ACL is actually the Administration on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities with NIDLR and others are looking into ways to improve data collection for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. There's going to be, I think, 3 groups created, and hopefully people here can get keyed into those. So if you're interested in getting involved in that data collection, I can hook you up with some people who might be able to help in that way. The thing about, I wouldn't, one kind of, I guess, unintended consequence, finding jobs is difficult, right? And if you say move out of shelter workshop environment, are there jobs available in the economy for an individual? But it also exposes individuals to recessions, right? And what I think happens, it's not necessarily first fired, last hired as much. That's a person story. But on a population level, what I see happening, and I believe happens, is that people with disabilities lose their jobs with everyone else during a recession. Many of those customized jobs that have been worked on for years, whether it's through a federal agency or through family friends, those jobs go away too. But they don't recover faster, right? They have to recreate those jobs. They have to re-customize jobs with either a new employer or the previous employer. And so it's going to take a while. And so we see a lag. We may also see that lag because people with disabilities may enter the Social Security disability programs, which aren't necessarily time limited like unemployment benefits or TANF. Long story short, there's a very interesting story to be told. The data really doesn't bear it out because the data doesn't exist. With regard to your second question about age, certainly men over 50 are the other group that is this untapped resource that is employment is rising as we reach full employment. I haven't specifically looked at those groups as in our analyses, but that's certainly feasible.
Excellent. So I think we probably have some questions online, and so I think I'm going to pump to that, but then we won't forget you out in the corner over there. Go ahead. Let's do one online.
I have 3 questions from online. So the first question is there any data about the percentage of people with disabilities broken down by age and sex, both at the national and the state level?
That's a great question.
Yes. The supplement that's been mentioned a few times is an expansion of the basic compendium content, and that can be found online, and it has breakdowns by age and race. And we have not broken down anything by gender yet, but if you contact us, that is something that we can do.
Okay. The second question is, for child-related data, is child find equally effective in all states? Could that impact the data?
So child find, could it impact the data? Of course, everything could. Whether we can identify the impact of that policy is a different story. I don't know. Could it? Yeah, but we'd need to test that. You'd have to do something like a difference in difference analysis of states that implement child find versus states that do not over time. So, but no, I can't say, but it's certainly possible.
Okay. One more broad question. What was surprising and not surprising about this year's compendium?
Lewis and And Eric, do you want to?
Yeah, actually, I want to say, at least from the annual report, and this isn't surprising necessarily this year, but I was particularly struck this year by that gap, those gap analyses, and how we've always, or historically, thought of, disability in the South, and unemployment in the South, and poverty in the South, and these narratives that we've had, and then when you look at it and you say, well, actually, if you compare it with those without disability, that's kind of the environment that there exists in the South. And so when you look at the gap maps, to me, that really sort of brought to bear, like, maybe the issue is not going on in the South because they have whatever is just going on in general about poverty and whatever in that part in the South, bad parts, or quote in quotes, and in the plain states good. But then when you take that gap map and you look at it and you see, really there's like these big differences in the Northeast and the East Coast, and that's a narrative that I haven't heard much talked about before, and to me that was what was surprising this year.
One of the things I found most interesting is the types of time trends that Andrew was presenting on earlier. The questions in the compendium are the result of years of standardization and testing, and we finally now have approaching 10 years of estimates with the same questions in these surveys, and we can really start to talk about what is going on with people with disabilities over time.
Probably, I don't know if it's new, but it's something that perked my interest that I've never seen. It may exist previously. Lewis presented a map of children 5 and under that Michigan had a high prevalence rate of disability, and Rhode Island. That may have to do with urban poverty. I don't know. Our good friends at the rural ROTC in Montana might be able to elucidate on that more. But there's a lot of variation within a state, and so I found that Michigan really struck me. Is it related to, say, Detroit and other places with the lead issues? I don't know, but boy, that really perked me up.
Excellent. Okay, and we had a question right over there. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Allison Cernish, National Institutes of Health. So in the health piece of the compendium you present on obesity, smoking, and on binge drinking, has there been any consideration of looking at opioid use or opioid dependence in the population of people with disabilities as we start to look at how to address that and what the prescribing patterns are, if that's accessible?
Some of my colleagues and I have started to look at that data for the purpose of writing a paper series, but we've also are talking about in the upcoming we've considered including that content. Yes.
Redacted at this time.
Yeah, so there's new data. For the first time, disability questions are being asked in the National Household Survey on alcohol and substance use. And so we've started looking at those data because it really provides a new opportunity. And one of the things that's kind of, as we're looking to expand the compendium, new data sources are coming online all the time. Sometimes they don't provide state level stuff that the compendium is really mostly designed to address. But we'll be opening up those data sources and either producing peer review research or other things. And so opioid is really got a lot of tendrils, and I've talked to some clinicians who are very concerned about limited spaces for people with long-term conditions, because a lot of opioid users are surviving and imposing or looking to tap the same service systems that have been traditionally tapped by people with disabilities. So.
Rhonda? Oh, I'm sorry. Is that Robin? Yes, Robin. Hi, Robin.
So I'm Robin Shafford.
Yes, hello, Robin.
And I'm looking at that 2008 number and the fact that 9 years later we haven't gotten back up there. And I know it's not really 9 years because the statistics aren't current. But just sitting here thinking about all of the huge policy advances that we've made over that time, the ADA Amendments Act regulations, the 503 regulations, the great culture change work that we've done, so that there was just this week a major news outlet reporting on the employment programs done at SAP and Microsoft, and yet we're still not back up to the same employment rate of people with disabilities that we were at 2008. So is there a way that we can look at these statistics and see and those policy advances and see, are some of them having an impact to bring us back up? To think from a perspective of policy and advocacy of where we should, what basket we should be putting our eggs in?
Good question. So the ability to identify causal impact of policy change is one of the biggest challenges facing social science, right? Using secondary data like big national surveys, the size of the ACS really helps, the sample size. I wish we had, 30, 40 years of the ACS, but we don't. It only goes back to 2008 with the current set of disability questions, 2000 before that. That's each, it takes years to produce and publish research and very careful research on population, on impacts of policy. You can do it with secondary data, but it's really tough and it's not always possible. There's also demonstration programs that can be tested, and that's kind of trying to draw closer to an experimental design. But to do it with data like these is really hard. You need to find ways to look at either before and after, or states that did or didn't have populations that were or were not affected. So you need to parse that out really carefully. So is there a way to do it? Yes. Is it possible? It takes quite a while to figure that out. Someone put the money sign up there. There are academics that do things for free. They have tenure and all that stuff. But it's probably the biggest challenge that I see in empirical social science is identifying causal impacts, because we can usually just talk about association.
So from what you looked at, do you have any advice about what basket we should be putting our eggs in, or is it just really too early? And I'm coming back next year, and I'm hoping we can show us being back at the 2008 number, but to really help us think about what we should be doing to get there.
Right.
And maybe, Andrew, we also had David down there that wanted to
Dave,
throw
you
in
want
some ideas
to jump
as well.
in. So my colleague David Wittenberg from Mathematica Policy Research is here. They have demonstration projects and really intensive research on specific programs, both for ODEP and SSA and RSA. Go ahead, Dave. I'll keep rambling if you don't say something.
I feel like I'm about to sing to you for some reason. I don't know. With the mic here.
Could you talk louder into the mic?
Closer.
I don't think it's on.
It's on. It's on. I really like this question a lot, because what we're looking at is a bunch of trends, and we're looking at national trends, and some of them are disturbing. And your question gets to, we've done a bunch of
Talking to the mic.
national policies. So what's working?
Put the mic really close.
Okay, sorry.
Because you got folks online too.
Where I want to go with the answer to this question is the thing that Lewis had mentioned. And I think that is one of the things that we can use the statistics for. So in answer to your basic question, can we answer from the national data how these policies are doing? No, because there's so many things that are going on in the background. In addition to all the things that you had mentioned, for example, you have changes in how the Social Security disability program is operating, the number of allowances that are occurring each year. You've also got changes in the demographics of the population, the aging of the population. So teasing that out of that trend is something that not only we should be careful of doing, we shouldn't do without caution. So the question is, where do we go for this? Where should we put our eggs in the basket? And what I think is really important is this evolution of county and state level statistics, because what you see is if you just presented those national data, you would just get a sense of, okay, there's a gradual trend towards these employment gaps. But that's not true in each state. It is varying by state. And so in answer to your question, I would be taking a very close look at triangulating some of these state data and putting your efforts into there to try to move the needle, including in local efforts. And that doesn't mean a devolution of programs to the state or local level. It means looking at the problem at those levels and then generalizing up. Because those are places where I think the greatest potential for innovation is. And if there's been potentially a mistake in federal policy that we've been making, sometimes we shoot too big with our huge demonstrations when we could be going for repeated smaller tests, and we can get our program operators failing quicker so they can move to the innovation faster. Things like places like Google run thousands of experiments each year. A handful of them work, but they work and they don't focus on the failures, whereas the federal government is in a very different situation. They don't get as many opportunities, so it's rethinking that. That's where I would take the interpretation of the data. So I hope that's a good answer to your question.
And can I support you on that one, David? I do think that the thing that I was talking about, it does sort of suggest that there's something going on in the states that I think could be dealt with, and also, and I think you'll see it in the compendium, but I've seen it before, there's actually a band of counties where this data is even more dramatic. And so it could actually be that a lot of effort could be focused on a few counties within states and turn things around really dramatically within, for the whole view of disability employment, disability poverty, whatever, by dealing with things within some counties, within some states.
Now I'm going to turn it to the amazing Nadia Ibrahim from the Office of Disability Employment Policy. She just got married, guys, in Hawaii. Anybody want to go? I know, it's so exciting. Nadia, take it away.
I just wanted to add ODEP's voice to this part of the conversation. We have had the privilege of working with a number of state intermediary groups over the last several years. Groups like the Council of State Governments, the National Conference of State Legislatures, and the National Governors Association, in working with state policymakers to advance disability employment policy at the state level. So I'm very encouraged to see that state level data and county level data is being considered and included this year. And we look forward to looking at the data more closely, because that's a question that we're consistently asked about state level data. So thank you so much.
Yep. Yeah, it's one reason the compendium is always focused really on states. The big time trends, as Dave Wittenberg mentioned, they tell a certain picture, they're important, but they leave you with lots more questions than answers. And state differences can, and as Louis said, county differences could really help focus in on places that things are going well and places that things are not going so well.
We have some questions online.
The first two questions are both somewhat related. What policies might result in undercounting among groups? And related, another question that came in was, I have found many people with disabilities decided to hide their disability after 2008 because they felt they had targets on their backs. Do you worry that this may have impacted your data?
Yes, 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 and yes, of course. So certainly how people perceive the questions that are being asked. The questions may remain the same, but how people perceive those questions or are willing to answer the questions may change over time. The prevalence rates have remained remarkably stable over time for many, many years, so I'm not sure that it may influence some, but not a large proportion of individuals. But there's two parts to that question. Oh yeah, so undercounting. Certainly proxy responses, the use of others to report on disability, is used in different surveys in different ways. And so there's always a concern that the proxy respondent is not adequately or accurately representing the person with a disability. Yes, I can. It's usually when I'm less comfortable with what I'm saying, I usually start waffling. And people living in institutional settings, it's very difficult to collect data for people living in institutional settings, either in correction facilities or in disability-related facilities, and so that's a way that people can be undercounted. So.
Great. And did we have a second question online, or was that it? Okay, good. And I see, do we have another question from our friend at Gallaudet?
Hello again. This is a little bit off the point, but I think it is related. I know most of your data is based on statistics and numbers, of course, number of collections from just different sources. But I'm curious, do you guys ever think about doing different methods of research to provide more qualitative data, interviews, or hearing stories from different individuals that have disabilities that are related to their education or their employment or their outcomes? Yeah. I'm wondering if you have had that opportunity, their stories, to empower them to maybe possibly also help influence some of your data and your statistics, but to focus on now and the current information you have, but also on previous research.
The answer is yes. We've considered it and roundly decided not to do it. No, just kidding. So advances in data collection with web-based surveys, which have challenges in terms of barriers to people with disabilities participating in such surveys. But web-based surveying has the ability to ask people lots of different questions, lots of different ways, including reporting information. The Kessler Foundation and the University of New Hampshire have conducted 2 surveys, one of people with disabilities and one of employers, supervisors, some of who do supervise people with disabilities, some of whom don't. And in those questions, we're able to get lots of great statistics and quantitative data, but we also ask people to report specific stories and specific issues after each question. And so that data is super, super rich, and we have a cadre of students and folks at Kessler as well digging into that data. Different methods, but sometimes more nuanced stories. And the thing I like about it, there's something called frontier analysis in economics, is that most of the time we're dealing with averages or medians, right? But what we really want with promising practices, that term that's frequently used, is to find what's not average, what's on the cusp of what's new, what's averaged out, what are the success stories, or even the challenging stories. I thought I was talking loud enough. I'm excited about this.
It was rubbing against your coat.
Oh, okay. So, the idea of being able to use web-based survey design and survey technologies to collect those stories, especially the ones that fall out of traditional statistics, which basically do averaging over populations and samples.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a few more questions in the audience. We'll jump there, and then I think I see John back there who really wanted to ask a question. and who else do I see? Is that Richard and Katya? Tad all want to ask questions, so we'll see if we have time for everybody.
When does this wrap up?
We have 5 minutes.
Okay.
Good morning. Rick Hernandez again with U.S. Department of Education. A question and a plea. Okay. First question.
Write this down.
I'm reflecting back on the pictures that you had up there about the proportion, the percentages of the population, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sort of thinking about, well, gee, California has 39,700,000 people in the population, and the District of Columbia has 700,000.
Mm-hmm.
So, when you reflect on the proportion of a population that has something, we mask really the numbers that California, Texas, and New York contribute. So I guess my question is, are those numbers in the compendium? Can I go back and take a look and find out, what the actual raw numbers that you're using that sort of are represented in there? So that's question number one. The plea is, I would ask you also to perhaps include the use of the PIAC, the Program for International Assessment of Adult Competencies, as a consideration for additional data. The PIAC is the international assessment of adults across many of the OECD nations and the United States. So one of the things that it provides us with a measure of the literacy, numeracy, and a secondary analysis of computer-based skills. So we might be able to take a look at, yes, we know the educational achievement, or it's sort of like academic performance, or not academic performance. We know the trajectory of students in terms of how far they have gone in education. But do we know the capabilities and skills? Because maybe those skills are limiting their ability to enter and advance in the workforce. So the PIAC gives us a measure of their literacy performance, which is the thing that we use to compare us against the international community. So that data is available on the OECD website. It is public information, and there's also restricted data. The big advantage of the PIAC is it's international, and you can start to make international comparisons. Yep. And again, the population manifested in that represents very closely to what you see in ACS. I mean, it's the same 11 to 14% of disabilities, but you're now able to sort of say, well, what's happening in the U.S. compared to Sweden, compared to Spain, compared to Israel, compared to Russia, and I think that would add a really interesting flavor to your ability to interpret some of this data.
Yeah, we used to have a couple tables presenting international statistics. Just like Dave was mentioning, states provide an opportunity and Lewis counties provide an opportunity to look at differences. Certainly, cross-national comparisons, international comparisons provide that capacity as well. There's several data, both in terms of education and health, and Eric is doing some work, and Julie Weeks is here. She could talk about the Washington Group United Nations effort to harmonize the collection of disability statistics over countries. Yeah, we'd love to include more statistics internationally. It does get difficult. I've have this languishing paper that's doing international comparisons of employment using, gosh, now I'm going to blank on the data. So there's an OECD data file, harmonized data file that now I'm blanking, but I've used that. There are some issues. The prevalence rates swing wildly. You know, the Netherlands has the highest prevalence of disability with almost 60% for some subpopulations, and so it does pose challenges. With regard to percentages, all percentages, the numerator and denominator are provided, so you can get those volume numbers. They don't make great maps because the same people show up all the time when you do size counts, but all the numerators and denominators for every percentage are available in the compendium.
And I have 30 seconds for a final last question. I think, John, did I see your hand back there? John really wanted to ask this last question. All right, John, AUCD in the house.
Thank you, Michael, for recognizing that I had a question I didn't know I had. So part statement, part question to any of our panelists. We don't really have a federal disability data strategy or plan. This is tremendously helpful information. There's a lot we know. There's more that we don't know. Do you have any reason for optimism? And I'll look at some of my federal agency friends around the room as well. Are there any conversations that you are aware of that would move us closer to a strategy to get data that we don't have? And the way that we took a very deep dive 10 years ago in one particular data set to get some additional information. And I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, so, there is an effort, not within the disability community, but within primarily people who do poverty research, to increase the link of survey and administrative data. So things you can do, we did a study with Gallaudet years ago, not Gallaudet, NTID, years ago, where you could look at the earnings history before and after graduation from NTID. And that was really powerful stuff. It took a lot of work to work through SSA, get the earnings files mapped up and everything. But it was a sustained long-term effort. There is an effort broadly across the country in the area of poverty research to do that kind of thing. And I think that the disability organizations would be very wise to keep track of that and support it in any way. And probably the best thing is that my former colleague, Rich Burkhauser, is now on the Council of Economic Advisors, so the panel of 3 economists in the Eisenhower building as part of the White House advisory staff. And Rich is a long believer in better data and matching data he's the one that did the NTID study. And so he knows the power of the data. I doubt he has much power in the federal government, but it helps to have allies sometimes.
If I can add to Andrew's, just another, looking at your federal colleagues, I think the other initiative that could be undertaken, and I think it was recommended recently in a National Academy of Medicine paper that just came out a few weeks ago, is to incorporate the disability questions, even just the basic 6 ACS, into large federal surveys across the board as part of the demographics. So just as we ask about sex, and just as we ask about ethnicity, and just as we ask about age, this should be part of the general demographics, and those questions have been tested and have gone through cognitive testing. And it's very difficult to get preventive health information and or other economic or any other national data trends without them being part of the core demographic set. That's just, and that's probably not representing, this is my personal opinion, does not represent, but after looking at a number of federal data surveys, I think that would be a major first step.
And as you looked around the room at your federal colleagues, I do want to pass it to Savi at ODEP. Do we have somebody else?
I'm sorry.
Let me just follow up on that statement. So for health surveys, it's required under the ACA for national health surveys, our federal sponsored health surveys. So it's required based on guidance put forth by US DHHS. It's not for economic and other surveys. I'd love to see the 6 questions in the consumer expenditure survey so we could see how much people with disabilities are involved in the economy. Robin and I did a paper years ago where we kind of quasi-estimated that, but it would be great to have that in the consumer expenditure survey and other surveys that are not subject to the ACA and the guidance that came from there.
All right, this is very quick, 10 seconds, go.
Yes. I'm afraid friend David raised my anthropologist hackles here. And I want to really encourage folks to do real multi-methods work. I'm sorry, you can't just say to agencies you should fail faster. It's a very complex thing. And, looking at policy and culture and all of that. And so I'm hoping there can be more things that take this kind of data and look at them in relationship to policy and administrative data and the kind of surveys that Kessler has been doing.
Great, and let's pass it to Savi. Last comment, and then we'll finish it out.
I just wanted to quickly add to what John was asking. In the past public workforce system, we were collecting just a very small amount of data about people with disabilities. Since WIOA, the whole data system is going through changes, and we have added about 15 different questions. And we hope to collect a lot more data that would give us a lot more detail about who's going through the public workforce system. And I hope that would add to the discussion in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Savi. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to our panelists. Let's give these guys a big round of applause. They do so much work throughout the year. And we're going to continue celebrating the compendium because we get to celebrate good times. Come on. It's exciting. So we're going to take a quick break at this point and do some networking, celebrating the compendium, celebrating these statistics, talking about what we got to change, what we want to work towards. If you did have questions, these guys will stay up here for a few minutes, and then we are reconvening.
In the back as we talk.
What?
They pop the champagne. In the back.
Oh yes, we are popping champagne in the back. Thank you, sir. We are reconvening at 10:40. So at 10:40, come back in here. For our folks online, you can also take a little bit of a break as well. But please make sure to come back at 10:40 sharp so we can get started. Thank you.